And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Ron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Culver. Our goal for each episode each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible, growing and edifying the body in the process. This is our 20th episode in our Journey Through the Scripture series. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to the discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find this linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit about ourselves, the genesis of our podcast name, and provide several helpful resources to help you dig further into redemptive history, no matter where you are in your journey. From time to time, Kit and I will also respond to direct responses, questions listeners such as yourself pose to us that fit a current topic. You can reach out to us at contact at roadfromemmaus.com. That's contact at roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast and so that you receive notifications for our fresh content. We will drop a new episode every Monday, so we look forward to you taking this exciting ride with us as we journey through the scriptures. Just to kind of recap where we've been over the last several weeks, we've really kind of dug in. Think of it almost kind of like a pause in your journey where you kind of camp out for a while. And similar to what we see the Israelites doing in the desert, we've actually taken quite a bit of time to just really understand what is happening with the Sinai covenant and everything that pertains to it. Our focus for this week is really going to be digging into what is the provision of a mediated system that is provided, and then how does that help inform not only what is happening with Israel and their relationship with God at that moment, but ultimately, what does this now portend, and how does that now point forward to the relationship that they will have as a covenant community with God as we move forward? With that moving forward, we want to open it up with kind of a question, and we really encourage you guys to continue to look at the notes. We know a lot of you are audio listeners, but we really think like there's power in actually reading the notes as you listen as well to really hear and understand these things through two different gates. So our initial question is, what are the two crucial realities that did a God's provision of the priestly system reveal as we really start to understand what's taking place in this moment, Kit?
Well, I think the first thing I'd like to do is just again remind everybody, because we have such a struggle with this idea of law and law of Moses and how to think about the law of Moses as the covenant with Israel, and recognizing, remembering again that this was the way in which God was ratifying the Abrahamic relationship with Abraham's descendants. Recall that God had called out Abraham, set him apart to himself, made a covenant with Abraham, that Abraham would be the instrument of God's blessing going out to all the families of the earth. Ultimately, that in the restoring of the human creature, the entire creation would be restored. Abraham was to be the conduit, the vehicle, the instrument for God ultimately undoing the creational curse. And that covenant that he made with Abraham was then passed on to Isaac and then on to Jacob. And we saw how Jacob becomes the man Israel. His name is changed to Israel. And then the man Israel is corporatized in the tribes descended from his sons. That's the people of Israel that then God delivers from Egypt. And he does so according to that covenant faithfulness. He sends Moses to them to say, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've remembered my covenant. And now is the time for me to move that covenant forward with you as his descendants. So when God brings Israel to Sinai, it's not to give them a bunch of rules and regulations or even some sort of kind of abstracted eternal moral law or something. This is my standard for you. It was really about confirming and establishing and defining this Abrahamic relationship with Abraham's descendants, which we saw is defined most narrowly in terms of a father and a son. Israel had been described by God, even as Moses' words were to come to Pharaoh, Israel is my son. let my son go that he might worship me and serve me in the wilderness. So God is establishing this covenant relationship at Sinai as the defining and prescribing of the father-son relationship. What it would mean that God would be the God of these people, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would now be that same covenant God unto this family of people descended from Abraham, but also what it would mean for them to understand and fulfill their own sonship, which is their sonship on behalf of the blessing of God going to all the families of the earth. So that's really the fundamental way that we have to understand the covenant at Sinai. And what we see in this provision of a priestly system, if we recall, what priests do is they mediate a relationship between some god or deity or power. You know, religions have priests, and the priests stand between the worshiper or the people and the god or the deity that's being worshiped. And so God's establishing of a priesthood is that this is to be a mediating instrument between him and Israel. So you have, first of all, the fact that God's relationship as father to a son is not going to be immediate in the sense of absolutely direct and present. As we're going to see, God's going to dwell in the midst of his people, which was the Abrahamic promise, right? I'll be your God, you will be my people, I will dwell with you. He's bringing them to Canaan in order to dwell with them. They will dwell with him in his sanctuary land. But the priesthood shows that there's going to be an intermediary between Israel and God. The father-son relationship will be a matter of managed distance, if you will, mediated distance. So that's the first thing. And because it's a managed relationship, a mediated relationship, what's implied in that is that there is some sort of distance between the father and the son. Israel cannot have, if you want to think of it this way, Israel cannot have direct access to its God. The son is, in a sense, held at a distance from the father, and the relationship is mediated. It'd be like, you know, you or I with our father, somebody standing between us and our father and carrying letters back and forth or correspondences, and we don't have any direct access to the father. And in that sense, the father has no direct access to us. So that priestly mediation implies the fact that Israel is and will continue to be a failed son. It will not be capable of having the sort of immediate, intimate, familiar relationship with God that you would expect with a father-son relationship. And so that implicates this whole thing of, well, wait a minute, these are the children of Abraham. These are the ones who their sonship is to be the instrument through which God's blessing will come to all the families of the earth. If Israel can't be a son in the true sense, if its relationship has to be mediated, then how is God's purposes for the world that has been bound up in them, how is that actually going to come about? How is God going to ultimately fulfill his design for the world? So when we see the priesthood, it has huge implications, more than just, okay, these are the priests and it's the Levites and they do this and they do that. It really speaks to, again, a threat to God's purposes for his creation when you flesh it all out.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue to how is the priestly system distinct from the Sinai covenant and yet intimately related to it as well? I think some of our listeners may be wrestling with that. We see that there's a level of connection there too, but we want to be careful about making sure that that's not a one-for-one correspondence as well.
Right. And I think probably many people, I think at least many Christians, just tend to assume that the priesthood was kind of an integral part of the covenant because it comes in the context of that giving of the covenant, making of the covenant. But the way the text actually fleshes that out, we saw last time that Moses records the words of the covenant and then ratifies that covenant with the people. And then he and representatives of the people go up to encounter Yahweh on the mountain, and they have this fellowship meal together. And after that is completed, um, everybody goes back down the mountain, but Moses continues on up. God says, "Come up to me." And Moses is then on the mountain, Mount Sinai, for 40 days. And it's during that time, after the covenant has been recorded and ratified with the people, it's during that time that God gives to Moses the prescription for the sanctuary, for the priesthood, for all of that. And so I think the text does that most likely to get the reader to ask the question, well, wait a minute, Israel covenantally is the blameless son who is in the presence of God. And as the text says, these worshipers saw God and they were not, destroyed. God didn't take them out or anything. So the fellowship meal that just precedes this 40 days on the mountain, Israel is covenantally blameless with God. It has immediate communion and fellowship with God. Well, then why is God giving to Moses a prescription for a priesthood in a tabernacle where he's going to be with the people, but at a distance from them? Well, we find out very shortly, because while Moses is on the mountain, the people are already breaking the covenant. So you have two things going on. Moses is on the mountain receiving the prescription for a tabernacle and a mediating priesthood to manage that relationship, while the people are down on the ground breaking the covenant, breaking the relationship. And Moses, when God makes him aware of it, he'll come down the mountain and smash the tablets, right? You've broken the covenant. So it's kind of an interesting way the text does that. But you see Moses being given something that at that point, it doesn't seem like is even necessary. But down on the ground, out of Moses' sight and out of his understanding, we see exactly why this priesthood is going to be necessary. So you have a separation in a certain sense between the covenant and the priesthood. The priesthood is the way that the covenant relationship will be upheld and preserved in the context of Israel being an unfaithful son. And you get a hint of the separation. You don't know exactly what all of the nature of the distinction is, but the writer of Hebrews says this interesting thing that the covenant was founded on the priesthood. He doesn't say the priesthood is a part of the covenant. He says, in a very real way, the priesthood stands behind the covenant. The covenant is founded on the priesthood. And as we've kind of even hinted today, it's at least largely because the only way the covenant can be maintained and upheld is if there is a mediating priesthood. A priesthood is the foundational premise for a successful covenant between the faithful God and Father and his unfaithful son.
One of the things I think our listeners are wondering, and I think even as I initially engaged the text, is it's like, okay, this law is actually revealing the people's lack of covenant faithfulness, right? Not faithfulness to it. But on top of that, logically, why is God now using people which he know are suspect and broken and fallible to then uphold this too? And to your point, like the priestly system stood outside of that covenant, but it was ultimately like the administrative component of that too. So he's like, great, the people's covenant unfaithfulness was already exposed, but it was now going to be exposed by people that God already knew were fallen and broken and were actually counterfeit sons. Kind of help us make sense of that, because I feel like that's a logical tension. It's like, why did you actually use the very people you know were broken to highlight the brokenness and lack of covenant faithfulness, which you knew that already existed?
You're talking about the priests themselves
Yeah,
as
the
being
priests
a part of
themselves in
that,
terms of that too, like who were part of this community, which was already radically defined by their covenant and faithfulness. But
right?
yet I'm actually going to take a distinct group out of a group that itself was already permeated with covenant and faithfulness. And I think that's what people might be wrestling with, Kid, as well.
Yeah, and I think to kind of draw a sharp line underneath that truth, we're going to see, I think, in the next episode that that the very man that God chooses to be, in a sense, the starting substance of the priesthood, Aaron himself, all of the priests were descendants of Aaron. Aaron is the one who orchestrates, before he's even a priest, before he's even entered into the priesthood, he's the one who orchestrates and administers Israel's rebellion against God, this first fundamental act of idolatry in the making of the golden calf. So even before God has actually established Aaron and his sons as priests, Aaron's already shown himself to, in a sense, be under his own
Great leadership right
inertia.
off the
Yeah,
bat, kid. Great
for
leadership
his
right off
own
the bat.
reasons. He's taking up, in a sense, the priestly role by being the guy who, on behalf of the people, builds the golden calf. So God is underscoring the fact that these priests are not going to be able to successfully mediate this relationship because they're no different from the people who they're mediating for. And all of this comes out, and this is beyond where we want to go today, but these things are important in the Hebrews writers' arguments concerning the way in which Jesus fulfills, but in a superior way, all of these dynamics and aspects of Israel and its life and its system, the law of Moses, the priesthood, even Moses himself. All of that failed, all of that fell short, and he comes as the one in whom all of those things are yes and amen. Even the tabernacle itself, even the sanctuary itself, he is the one who embodies and fulfills that. So there's no doubt from the outset that this isn't going to go well, and somehow God's going to have to be the one who will uphold the covenant. And even perhaps ironically, just as the priests are as fallen and unable to keep the covenant as the people of Israel are, God gives this sacrificial system, this system that those failed priests will administer, which becomes the way to again deal with covenant transgression and infraction, to preserve the relationship on an ongoing basis in the context of ongoing failure.
Indeed. I'm really glad you stamped that point. Kit, what function did the tabernacle serve in the context of the Sinai covenant? And then how did the tabernacle further illumine Israel's essential failure as God's son? Remember, like the relational component that like we've really been trying to emphasize to our listeners, and his intended remedy for this estrangement that was definitely present. And that we, to your point, Kit, we saw very vividly, even with the calf incident, which we're obviously going to impact on our next episode as well.
Right. Well, the tabernacle, like the priesthood, speaks to this situation, this dynamic of a father-son relationship, but one that falls short. A father-son relationship that doesn't really fulfill the truth of a father-son relationship in terms of perfect communion, perfect intimacy, perfect oneness. Our listeners again need to recall this idea of sonship biblically is that a son is of the father. You see the son, you see the father. The son is the one who manifests the truth of the father in word, will, deed in the world. And that's at the heart of Jesus' statements, when you see me, you see the Father. But Israel was to be the one through whom God would be made known in the world. Israel's faithful sonship would reveal the Father. Well, that's what the father-son relationship was supposed to be, but it wasn't that, and it couldn't be that. And just as there was a priestly system to mediate that relationship, to manage the distance, so the tabernacle itself spoke to that. The first thing that God says to Moses in Exodus 25, when Moses goes up the mountain, is take a contribution from the people to build me a sanctuary that I might dwell in their midst. The sanctuary represents the place where God is going to be present in the world, and more narrowly, the place where he's going to be present in the midst of his people. And we're going to see that the sanctuary, which is, it's basically a portable temple or a portable dwelling place for God. the tabernacle sits in the midst of the 12 tribes. You've got 3 tribes on each side. So God is in the midst of his people. Well, there's that idea of you're my people, I'm your God, I am your father, you are my son. It speaks to God being present in the world in the midst of his people. But at the same time, the way the tabernacle is designed is God is veiled from them and inaccessible to them. He's dwelling in their midst, but behind a bunch of layers, they can't get at him. And even the priest can't get at him. The high priest, we'll see, once a year can go into what represents the very presence of God, the Holy of Holies, where his Shekinah glory cloud is present, above the Ark of the Covenant. But that's a fearful, dangerous thing as well for him to do. So the irony is that God is in the midst of his people. He's taken a people to himself, and he sits in their midst, but in a way that it's at a fearful, obvious distance. They can't get at him. And the tabernacle speaks to that same dynamic of failed sonship. And a failed sonship that brings into danger and crisis God's whole covenant intention, not just for the human race, but for the total creation. Israel's failure means the failure of the project for the entire created order that God has in mind.
We continue to bring up this phrase failed son, counterfeit son too. And I think some of our listeners may be wondering if this really is the identity that really speaks to who Israel is, just in terms of where they are with God. Can we say then that they have no value? Because like I think what people might be wrestling with, kid, is just like if like they're counterfeit, why does God not just do away with them? Like in other words, typically if something is counterfeit, it has no value and worth. And what we're saying is just the opposite, and that God will actually use them, and there's a very clear purpose. Can you maybe unpack that a little bit? Because we don't want our listeners walking away with their perception too that while they are certainly counterfeit indeed, that there is no worth or purpose in terms of their existence at this point, especially in redemptive history.
Yeah, and I don't know that I'd use the word counterfeit, because to us that means something that is completely false.
Right.
It's not the real thing. And by God's election of Israel, Israel was the fleshing out of the election of Abraham, right? Israel was legitimately covenant son of God. It wasn't a counterfeit in that sense. It wasn't a facsimile. It was by God's design and intention, and by covenant definition and prescription, Israel was son of God. The problem was Israel could not fulfill its sonship. And that point of tension carries on and just gets exacerbated throughout the rest of the Old Testament history, until finally, again, God just departs from them and sends them away. And now this reality of an alienated relationship is made abundantly clear in a physical exile. God has left them, he has sent them away, but his promise is that he will end this exile one day. He will restore the relationship. He will bring the renewal of the covenant relationship, and that will involve dealing with the sin, the deviation from the truth, the unfaithfulness that has created this chasm between God and them in the first place. Well, this is where Jesus himself comes into the picture. He is the Israelite in whom Israel fulfills its sonship. So if we can say Israel's the real deal, but they cannot fulfill the fact that they're the real deal, and so they become the real deal in the one Israelite who is that seed of Abraham through whom Israel will become Israel. And so God, this is the way that God can, the only way he can ultimately uphold his purposes, because he has by covenant determination bound up all of this in Abraham and his descendants. And so unless God's going to go back on his word and be unfaithful to his covenant, somehow the Abrahamic seed, the Abrahamic people have to fulfill their election. And how do they do that? Well, God will, and this, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but this is how the messianic picture gets developed through the Old Testament. God will somehow raise up from within the Abrahamic people a servant, son, disciple, witness, an Israelite, a son of Abraham, who will actually be what Israel could not.
Yep.
And so, therefore, he will be the servant Israel through whom Israel will become Israel and be renewed and restored so it can get on with its election, its calling under election, to be God's light to the nations. And so Jesus becomes that one in whom this covenant is fulfilled, the covenant calling and election, and then he reconstitutes in himself and around himself a new covenant household, a new Israel, which ultimately then starts taking in the Gentiles as well. And this is why Paul can say, if you belong to the Messiah, the seed of Abraham to whom the promises pertain, this is Galatians 3, if you belong to him, then you are the children of Abraham and the heirs of the promises made to him. And that's such a crucial thing that so many Christians don't understand. And I know we've, hinted before or talked a little bit about this thing of, the Jews as the people of God or the people of, well, who really are the children of Abraham? When God says he'll bless those who bless Abraham and curse those who curse Abraham, and this being bound up in the children of Abraham, who are those children? Who are the children of Abraham? And it's not Gentiles apart from Jews or whatever. What it is in the Messiah now, all men, Jew and Gentile alike, become children of Abraham by being taken up in him as the true seed of Abraham. And I know that there's a lot there, but
Oh, I know. Yeah. No, Kid, I think that's helpful too. And so I think even clarifying again and just stamping your point too, and I'm glad you even clarified my phrase, because to your point, when we say counterfeit, people bring different contexts and definitions to that. What I'm taking away then, and I think what we want our listeners is that Israel was always chosen son, but never consummate son.
right. It was always a failed son.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
the
In that
answer
sense,
was
yes.
not to get rid
Yes.
of it or start over again or come up with a new plan, but that God would make Israel be what it ought to be
Yep.
and what it could never quite understand, what was not entirely clear until the incarnation and the Messiah in the world, is that the way in which God would enable Israel to be Israel and fulfill the covenant from its side, just as he had fulfilled the covenant from his side, the way he would enable that to happen is by taking up Israel's own life and lot in himself in order to heal Israel from within. And that's what incarnation is all about.
Indeed. The Israelite tabernacle was intended to model Yahweh's heavenly abode, evident in the fact that he prescribed all of its details and allowed Israel no say in its structure and function. In this way, he also affirmed that he was bringing his dwelling to earth, specifically to dwell in the midst of his covenant people, which you've already alluded to. This is Exodus 25, 1 through 9. How do we reconcile this dynamic of heaven on earth, Kit, and God's immediate presence with the fact of his veiled distance and inaccessibility, which we talked about at the outset of our conversation today?
Right. This is kind of that whole dynamic of God present with his people, but at a distance. God the Father of his people, but inaccessible. Yes, he's with them, but he's really not. Yes, he's in their midst, but at a distance. Yes, they have access to him in a very limited way, but not in any kind of open, free, unmanaged kind of access. And you see that in the tabernacle as we spoke of. But again, I think it's important to recognize, and people often get hung up in the details of the number of boards and how the boards are joined together and how the linens are made and all of the vast details of this tabernacle and its furnishings and even the priestly issues and all of that, and they want to find meaning in the details of the numbers of the boards and the geometry of the structure and all of that. And really, it's God is giving to them a precise and comprehensive definition simply for the purpose of underscoring the fact that this is his dwelling on the earth. If they in any way said, okay, let's make a temple that looks like this, let's make the fabrics be like this, let's have this number of layers, this number of boards, this size of boards, if they made any kind of contribution to the definition of this sanctuary, then it would ipso facto not be Yahweh's sanctuary. And the writer of Hebrews makes it clear that Moses was instructed to design and construct the components of this sanctuary according to the definition that God gave to him, because this was to be a model of the heavenly reality. And when you build a model, you're making, as it were, a kind of copy of something that already exists, something behind it. If I go to the hobby store and buy a model of a 64 Corvette Stingray, I'm not innovating anything, right?
Right.
And in fact, for that thing to be what it claims to be, it's got to exactly replicate
Yep.
that thing that is behind it. And so what is the thing that's behind the tabernacle? It's this idea of God's habitation where God dwells. And as you said, even in reading the notes, the idea here is that God is going to dwell in the midst of his people. He's bringing, as it were, his dwelling place to earth. This is going to be the place where heaven and earth come together. And you see that same sort of imagery, obviously, at the end of Revelation. So God is wanting his people to understand this is him legitimately coming and dwelling with his people. But once again, not in a way where they have open, free access to him. And this is all ideas that come out in the book of Hebrews, the tearing of the veil at the death of Jesus. And now, we have entrance into the presence of God through the veil that is the flesh of Jesus. Nothing has to manage now our sonship with God except Christ, but in the sense that we are now taken up in his life. And so we are the dwelling of God in the Spirit. We become a part of this sanctuary idea, right? In that sense. So what's happening with all of this is that what God is intending for the world, what God is making known, is his intent is to come to the earth and dwell on the earth. It's not for souls to go off to heaven. It's for God to come and dwell on the earth, and ultimately for the whole creation to become sacred space, God to fill all in all. Well, that's what he's modeling here. That's what Israel is to be an instrument in, but we're not there yet. We're not there yet. God is still, even though he's present, he's not really present. He's not accessible. And in fact, if the relationship is going to be maintained, there's going to have to be an exacting adherence to a system of atonement and managing of a broken relationship, again, through the priesthood and the sacrificial system.
During our next couple of episodes, we're really going to dig into what's probably one of the most well-chronicled, well-known events. It's Hollywood depictions, you name it, too, like the Golden Calf episode 2.
Right.
If there's one thing that we want our listeners to really have framed up right going into that, because sometimes I think it's important before we get in the car and we venture to that spot in this story, that we at least have an idea what's true, what's not. Like what should our framework be going into that, as we really dig into that over the next couple of episodes, Kit?
Well, as we've talked so much, even in our intro episodes, kind of framing this study, we talked a lot about the need to be wearing the right pair of glasses, the need to, in a sense, let the scripture tell its story its way, instead of us coming with our questions, our perspective, our 21st century religious ideas or whatever, and insist that the Bible say what we want it to say and answer the questions and concerns that we happen to have. We have to learn how to listen to it and be sensitive to what it is that it's trying to get at. And that involves this thing of the cultural rivers, right? The golden calf means what it means in the context of Israel's situational, covenantal, historical setting and relationship with God. It doesn't mean what we happen to think it means or the ideas that we're concerned about in our culture, where we even feel like, oh, we're so far removed. We don't make idols. We don't do this. We don't do that. And to be able to interpret that in its own biblical and ancient Near Eastern context is going to be very important.
I agree, Kit, too. And I was hoping you were going to speak to cultural rivers. And just if that is unfamiliar, please make sure you look at our glossary. It's one of our resources on our website. We really want to encourage you that you really dig into our ecosystem. Yeah, the podcast is one of those key areas for entry, along with the notes and other resources. But we have a ton of great resources, books, recommendations that can really strengthen your journey, your walk as you really explore these things in depth. We sincerely hope that this time you share with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And make sure you hit that bell for notifications. And we look forward to you joining us for the next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.